Welcome everyone. Just some quick housekeeping before we start. So we have Zoom automated closed captions available today. So to turn these on or off, please do click the closed caption button in the Zoom toolbar. We are recording this session and we will make our manifesto and this recording available afterwards. In this session, only our speakers and panelists will appear on camera, and therefore only they will appear in the recording. Today we'll hear an introduction from Vicky Spratt. Then our CEO, Tom Chance, will run us through the CLT Network's manifesto. Following that, we'll hear from a panel of speakers chaired by Vicky Spratt. And then after this, we will put some of your questions to our panel speakers, Vicky and Tom. Throughout the session, please do put your questions in the Q&A pop-up, which you can see in the Zoom toolbar. When you write any questions, please do remember to include your name, organisation, and who the question is directed to. Okay, so just before I hand over to Vicky Spratt, I'm just going to quickly introduce her a little bit. So Vicky is an award-winning journalist, author, and housing rights advocate. Her book, Tenants, was a Financial Times Book of the Year in 2022. She is a columnist and housing correspondent at the iPaper, where her work has seen her nominated for a British Journalism Award and shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. In 2017, her campaign succeeded in getting letting fees banned. Since then, she has given evidence in Parliament and has been name-checked by ministers on the floor of the House of Commons because of her reporting on homelessness. Her work has contributed to several other major policy changes. So handing over to you, Vicky, for your introduction.
Well, thank you, Josie. That's a very generous introduction, a bit embarrassing. I am delighted to be here today because I, as Josie just outlined, spend a lot of my time reporting on the housing crisis and in all of its, frankly, horrifying manifestations. And I think every article I write which talks about the scale of the problem reminds me that we need solutions. And I think that community land trusts and generally bringing more community ownership into how we get out of this mess is a really, really positive and hopeful space. And I wish that there was more discussion of it. So I am excited to be here today to talk about what it might be like if people had more of a stake in the place that they live, if they had more of a say over the kind of homes that were built there, if they had more of a financial stake in it too, not just having things imposed upon them by developers that they've never met, never spoken to. I'm also really interested in how that might encourage long-term investment in places and not just speculation. I think hopefully we'll get to talk a bit about that today. And before I introduce my really brilliant panel, I just wanted to mention a visit I did a couple of years ago to Grimsby. I met with a local group there called East Marsh United. Now, they're not a community land trust, but some of the work they're doing is very similar to what community land trusts do. And they were buying up dilapidated homes as a group of local people who were distressed by homes being left empty in Grimsby and left in a dilapidated state and rented out to local people in poor condition. And they were buying them up, developing them and renting them out at affordable rents. And they had big ambitions to do more. And I think some of the proposals that we're going to talk about today and this general thinking of community ownership, if it were encouraged and it became even more mainstream, I really do think the sky's the limit in terms of getting us out of the national mess we're in. And I'll just quickly outline what that mess is, because there's some pretty depressing statistics out today that I think serve as a reminder of why we do need to talk positively and we do need to talk about solutions, not just problems. Homelessness is rising. Street homelessness is rising. The number of families in temporary accommodation is going up. The number of people facing eviction is going up. House prices remain high, even though the market's in a bit of a stall. And it doesn't have to be like this. So now, the panel you're going to hear from today, we've got Mark Gregory, Chair of Labour's Community Ownership Commission, Kane Emerson from the YIMBY Alliance. I imagine most people on this call are familiar with that acronym, but for anyone who's not, it means yes in my backyard. Rose Grayston, who is an independent policy advisor who does lots and lots of brilliant work on the housing market as a whole, and Nicholas Boyes Smith, who heads up Create Streets, and he's a real specialist in this area He's also involved with the Office for Place, and he is a network trustee of the Community Land Trust Network. So first, Kane, I thought we'd start with you. Speaking of yes in my backyard, there's a problem. We can't really get homes built at the rate we need to get them built. What role do you think community land trusts could play in helping us do that?
Sorry, Vicky, do you mind? I was going to talk about the manifesto first, and then we have the panel discussion.
Sorry, I forgot about that. Please do introduce
straight
the
over.
manifesto.
That's all right. It's such an interesting panel. We're all eager to hear what they have to say, but I'll just give everyone a bit about our manifesto first. I'm just going to share my screen, and also just some good news for you that East Marsh United is in fact a community land trust. So there we go. So we're publishing our manifesto today. Thank you very much all for joining us, and especially for the panel and Vicky for joining us in discussing this. And whoever is in government will need to generate more popular support for the kinds of development we need in this country. And we think that up and down the UK, there are many people, a majority even in our communities, who recognise the need for more homes, who recognise the need for more investment in areas that have been left behind, and who recognise the transition we require to achieve net zero. But they have no tools. Really, the only role we give to communities at the moment is to act as blockers by objecting to stuff. And we think if we can give people the toolkits to be part of that solution, they will jump at it. Our mission is to make community-led development commonplace, and we think this can be a means to the government's mission to get that popular support for development. What might that look like with housing? Well, we've talked about wanting to see 5% of the house building market being community-led development. By the end of this parliament, we would want to see 15,000 homes a year being developed through community-led development, and over £1 billion of assets coming into community hands each year. And we think that's both very ambitious but achievable. And we know what this looks like in practice because it's already happening up and down the country. Whether in Kennet, co-designing a new garden community, building it out with a volume developer, and the Community Land Trust owning the affordable homes and the open space and community amenities once it's completed. It looks like we can make in Bristol people in housing need directly building their own homes in the back gardens of their neighbours who recognise the need for new homes within that community and able to then densify suburban parts of our cities. It looks like Yulegrave, people working in the local community in partnership with a housing association to build much needed social housing in a model that's been incredibly popular in very sensitive rural areas of the country where normally people don't like to see development. And many of these CLTs go on not just to do housing, but develop a whole range of assets needed for their communities, such as shops, pubs, and even in Swaffham Priory in Cambridgeshire, a district heating system to take the entire village off oil. It looks like young people getting opportunities for training and apprenticeships in renovating their own neighbourhoods, as in South Bank, in Redcar and Cleveland, or being able to take empty properties on high streets into community ownership in order to turn the first floor into affordable flats and create new retail and community space in the ground floor. This one in Wooler, the CLT also owns other community facilities, commercial space and affordable homes in the town, bringing a range of assets into community stewardship to really help that area prosper. And there are CLTs like this one in Wooler in other parts of the country, whether in Anfield in Liverpool or St Ives in Cornwall, that mix of assets that can be developed through community action. It looks like entire social housing estates in the central of London in community ownership, able to direct their own regeneration, demolishing buildings that are beyond repair, refurbishing others up to net zero standards, building new homes on top of their own homes, doing infill development. This is community-led social housing regeneration. It also looks like communities buying land for other reasons. So in Shropshire, local to me, a CLT that is buying up land for nature restoration, climate resilience and carbon capture, working with the Environment Agency, the National Trust and other agencies to improve the resilience of their communities through land ownership. What we see from all of this, and there is strong academic evidence looking at each of these different aspects, is that if communities have ownership of the land and if they have this agency and power, then you get more and more truly affordable homes. You get better outcomes in terms of CO2 emissions, better social cohesion and health through people being involved in it. It's a richer way to build not just homes or office space, but to really build communities. And communities see that. And so there is less opposition to community-led development, and there is an organized support, the YIMBY, the local YIMBY Alliance, that helps to get this stuff built. The problem we have is that while government has supported this in general, the approach to supporting it has been to treat it as a niche. And so communities are required to do everything entirely bottom up. There's a huge burden placed on communities to be able to bring schemes forward, to contend with very siloed government thinking, with grant programs and policies for high streets totally disconnected from those for housing, even though the housing might literally be on top of the shops in the high street, and has been bottled around small niche grant programs rather than thinking about how community-led development could access the main levers that government can pull in terms of funding and finance. And so it had remained a niche. But we know it can achieve scale. And we give two examples in our manifesto where this is happening. One is Middlemarch, a member of ours that works with almost 100 CLTs across Devon, Dorset and Somerset, helping them to partner with housing associations, and with very strong backing from local government in that region to show real scale. They do all the heavy lifting for and with the communities to bring those projects forward. And Core, which raised the finance and brought together the capability to purchase 6 solar farms and transfer those into community ownership, rather than expecting that communities raise the finance and develop a solar farm themselves. So the first part of our manifesto is wiring community-led development into policy in terms of how you get access to land and incentives for people to work with community-led developers with land, and also access to finance. So we call for the planning system to enable the allocation of sites for community-led development, and to really capitalise on the new community-led exception sites policy that we secured in the MPPF in December. So there are more land opportunities for community-led development. To also do that in large sites, to both diversify the range of housing being provided in large sites, and to ensure that everything that's built is then stewarded democratically by communities, not by unaccountable management companies. In both cases, picking up concerns that the Competition and Markets Authority raised this week in relation to large sites. And with regeneration, to begin writing in the rights or opportunities for communities to form a CLT and take ownership of and be involved in the regeneration of their estate or their local area. Those three would address the land and asset side, and then to look at things like the affordable homes programs and address particular problems in them for community-led development, including getting that pre-development finance into organisations like Core or Middlemarch to be able to bring these projects forward. And finally, to ensure that much needed reforms to leasehold and commonhold protect community ownership models, as has happened in legislation in this area in recent years. The other side of it is the market infrastructure we need in order to really wire this into the system. We need more Middlemarches and Cores. We need to develop that range of intermediary enablers and to give more confidence to industry, local government to partner with them to do projects, because most of this happens in partnership, not communities doing everything themselves. And so we need the Community Ownership Fund to be re-geared in that direction. More investment in schemes like our Growth Lab, which is helping new intermediaries bring new models to the market, and a community right to buy to strengthen communities' hands in negotiations over certain assets. And those 8 policy areas would create this joined up strategy to achieve a scale of around 5% of the market being community-led development. Communities would have the finance, the support, the partnerships to be able to do this stuff at scale, and the market would have a reason to want to work with communities and not see this as a difficult niche. We also want this thinking applied to other domains, and I showed the example of the CLT involved in nature restoration. They're much further ahead on this in Scotland than we are in England and Wales, and we want to really be applying some of this thinking to the way in which we rethink farming and sustainable rural communities. And we want permanent land commissions for England and Wales, modelled on the Scottish Land Commission, in order to continue to explore and develop policy around land ownership and stewardship and the kind of social purpose that we can achieve with land. So those are our proposals. We also set out a sort section on Wales, noting that many of these powers are devolved in Wales, and so we set out what MPs in Wales can do, as well as members of the Senedd, and what we want the Welsh Government to pick up from our manifesto. That's the introduction to our manifesto. Thank you very much. I'm very interested to hear what the panel and the other attendees think about it, and you'll be able to find it on our website later today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. Okay, so now back to you, Kane. The YIMBY lobby are very, very concerned about us being able to build homes. And there's a lot of conversation about the builders versus the blockers and who wants homes where and who doesn't. How could bringing more community ownership, more community stakeholders into the mix help us actually get homes built?
Yeah, so I think sometimes the YIMBY versus NIMBY narrative isn't quite as helpful as some people online might think it is. I think for development to be successful, for homes to be successful in the long term, and also just to even be built, it's really important to have community support and building that community support. So things like community land trusts can really build that support where there's broken trust at the moment with local authorities or housing associations, and can get homes built. So as a YIMBY, I would say it's really important to build a broad consensus around this. Previously I worked for a senior MP in Parliament, so did quite a lot of campaign visits. And it was quite interesting, actually, if you go into a community, one of the big rallying points in the community is over taking assets that are going to be sold off for housing, such as pubs, and turning them into community enterprises and bring them into community ownership. And it's really interesting because it just shows that communities want to shape how they live. They want to take ownership, they want to lead on development, and they want to do it the right way. So in getting homes built, it's really important to work with the community and build a consensus. So initiatives like community land trust are a really good way to do that.
Great, thanks, Kane. Really interesting. Next, Nicholas, you've done a lot of really interesting work on design and how involving people in the process of what sort of homes are going to be built in their area can have a really, really, really sort of huge effect on their acceptance of those homes. We hear so much about people being opposed to building, but that's not quite the case, is it?
No, thank you. And you said I was a trustee of the CLT Network, which I'm very proud to be. So of course I can't disagree with anything that Tom says, otherwise I get into big trouble. I don't. Yeah, and I think, look, the reasons why CLTs are the right thing to do. I mean, there's a sort of numerical reason. We're about, as you hinted at, Vicky, we're about 4 million homes short. So whatever you think, we need all taps on to fill the bath. So there's almost sort of just a sheer numerical level. Why would you not want this? I think and this comes to your question, there's actually a more profound reason than that as well, which is sort of my experience and looking at examples. There's a marvelous example on our website at the moment, which Tom helped us get up of the Broadwinds CLT, supported by Middlemarch, which he referenced. Communities are really good placemakers. So communities, they want to live there, or their kids are going to live there, or their cousins are going to live there. So they really think about it. And I had an insight, I remember a few years ago, I suddenly realized, and this is in a way not really to criticize them, but if you talk to developers, and I spend a lot of my time talking to developers, their client in the short to medium term isn't actually ultimately the person who's going to live there. It's the process they have to get through to buy the land, or to get planning, or to get highway sign off, or to get whatever it might be. And it can't really be otherwise. So they have to be sort of focused on that short term, particularly if they've had a competitive process to buy land. But communities are good placemakers because they instinctively, they can live there and they care about it. And that then I think links to a wider point, which is communities are good stewards of places and of land. They, by definition, they're therefore thinking to the future as well as to the current. So it's not just they can create places that people know their neighbours more. They're actually thinking about the weight with which communities tread upon the planet and the biodiversity and the hedges, the street trees. And I sort of hinted at one as well. They're also, and we're running a conference next week, Restitch, looking at how our neighbourhoods start being centrifugal, not centripetal. They start sort of coming together and reweave the social fabric. if we create places that people have gone through a process to create, rather than just taking something given at them by, whatever developer, that is part of that process. And that allows people to be in communion with the future as well as with the present and with the past. So I think there's quite a deep, and those are how we turn around the instinctive opposition that I'm afraid we do still see to housing. People agree that housing is needed in principle, but then in practice they remain, and we're beginning to see a generational change on this, but nevertheless remain very good at finding reasons not to do it here. So re-empowering people, giving them agency, giving them a sense it's not done at them by remote bodies, and actually that it will not, in a bad way, change the character of this neighbourhood are the ways. I mean, there's lots of research on why people oppose housing, but get those three right and reduce the risk of the new housing on existing lifestyles, and you'll unpick most of the problems. So I think those are the key reasons why this is the right thing to do, numerical and the thing. And if I can just do one more point, in a way, of building on what Tom was saying, I've sort of got my sort of vision of the future, picking up some of the ways that CLTs can work, rural exception sites, suburban infill, buying high streets. The thing that stops it growing at scale at the moment is risk and money. So the amount, when you speak to people who do this, or we've worked with many of them, it's almost tear-jerking how impressive they are, how much love they poured into it, how much time they poured into it over many, many years normally. We have got to normalize this. There will always be the hero CLTs. That's great. That's very, very laudable. Most of us, I certainly include myself in this, most of us won't rise to that level. So we've got to make this something that works more often for more normal people. I don't mean that rudely in any way about people who do it. So we've got to, I can imagine a situation, I think the current planning system is going there now. I hope it will continue to do so after the election, where there are clear codes and expectations for, increases to villages, for suburban infill, for purchasing of shops or flats above. So essentially you've completely taken out the planning risk. And the moment you do that, the amount of time and money and grant that you need up front starts to collapse. And it changes the nature of the financial support you need. And for this is an ex-banker speaking, forgive me, from a grant to a loan. There's a lot more capital around as loans than there is as grants. Grants, you essentially need a charity or the government. Loans, suddenly you can, as long as you're not completely destroying value, suddenly you've got a much wider market to sip in. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think there is actually broad political support for the CLT movement. And I think it's important, that Tom and his colleagues, that's maintained, because I think if this becomes a left versus right thing either way, I think that's not helpful. The concept of stewardship, which I personally am immensely attached to, I think is something that speaks to most of us across the political divide, as it should do. And I'd encourage us to hold on to that. But I think if we can just continue to have de-risk planning, then that will allow it to expand to what it should be, which is a really major part of the market of creating a number of homes we need. So that was probably a fuller answer than you wanted, but I hope that was of some help, Vicky.
No, very interesting. There's actually one thing I would like to pick up there, which I was going to ask later, which is the party politics of this fascinate me. Housing, I think everybody could agree, is currently top of the agenda, even when politicians really don't want it to be, because it's quite thorny, complicated. If there are certain things that will win elections, there are others that won't. But it strikes me, and every time I visit any community land trust, that this is such an obvious way to solve some of the problems we've got. Nicholas, I know you're often talking to people who hold the power. Do you think they understand that empowering people in the places that they live to have a stake in decision making is part of the answer?
It's very, one should be very careful saying what you think is in people's minds or what isn't, because of course one can never really know. I think there is general understanding across much of the political spectrum of that point in principle. I think what we've struggled with over the last generation, and what, if I'm honest, or half generation, what I perhaps initially struggled with, I hope I'm less so now, but probably still do, is actually understanding how we need to rewire planning and investment and risk to turn that easy to say thing, I don't mean that dismissively, into reality on the ground. I won't go into details, but there's a scheme we've been advising on recently, not a CLT, but it has some similarities, where we were helping a parish council code and create neighbour development orders for over 900 homes within their existing towns. So this is locally led by a parish, not by a CLT, but it's very local. I mean, bluntly, we've come a cropper on, we'll still get 100 or so through, but we've come a cropper on the cost of environmental impact assessments, the cost of this, the cost of that. And until you really get into the detail of all these requirements, that that understanding in principle doesn't actually change to simplicity and de-risk, de-cost process in practice. Because if you need, I mean, this is equivalent to what happened with neighbourhood plans, which are a good thing, and I'm pleased they exist, but you need to spend many months, lots of time, win lots of funding, and we've got to just make this an easier thing to do in a shorter period of time. So I think the understanding's there. I don't think bureaucratically or politically that has flowed through, forgive me, into all the detail that it needs to. I'm trying to fix some of that as best I can.
I know that you are. Thank you very much. Rose, you and I have spoken at length, in particular about your work on left behind places where communities have come in and had a stake in regeneration. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you think community land trusts could help us to regenerate some of the places in the country that have been, frankly, politically neglected.
Thank you. So yeah, the role of community-led housing in filling gaps in national policy and funding programmes is well established. For example, ensuring support from the Affordable Homes Programme reaches affordability-constrained rural and coastal communities, which for various reasons find it difficult to get housing passed. We've heard about some of them. But there's also a growing bank of evidence which demonstrates the unique role, I would say, of community-led housing in general and community land trusts in particular in underpinning effective regeneration in some of the country's most deprived places. Community-led approaches are retrofitting and improving empty homes and getting them back into use to meet local housing needs, as in the famous Granby 4 Streets in Liverpool and Gyroscope in Hull. They're squeezing out rogue landlords from neighbourhoods with high concentrations of poor quality private rented stock, as in Back on the Map in Sunderland. They're bringing forward new housing tailored to the needs of low income households on neglected brownfield sites that frankly are not going to get built out otherwise, as in Chapeltown co-housing in Leeds. These examples have come up again and again in my work on levelling up, much of it supported and funded by Nicholas Boyd-Smith through the Create Streets Foundation, I have to say. And what I'd observe is that community agency and ownership plays two vital roles in underpinning the specific problem of regeneration that works in deprived places. So on the one hand, it supports community-led action as part of bigger, broadening funding programmes to tackle housing and regen priorities that will ensure investment reaches people and places that are just otherwise going to miss out on that investment, often because of misaligned incentives. For example, absentee landlords in the northeast of England are really unlikely to improve old, cold homes on their own because house price appreciation is so low. There's no financial point in doing so. Whereas the community, the people that live in and next to dilapidated buildings and spaces, are uniquely incentivised to improve them at pace. And when these models are in place, that is what we see happen. Community agency and ownership of local homes, assets and businesses can also act as a bulwark against the negative consequences of regeneration investment. So as asset prices rise and gentrification sets in, local people on low incomes are often pushed out of a community undergoing regeneration because they can no longer afford rents and prices. On the other hand, other locals with higher incomes, with some housing wealth, often choose to sell up and move out as regeneration funding comes in and conditions start to improve, and that weakens community ties. Community agency and ownership builds resilience to these trends and slows them down. If more people are owner-occupiers and fewer private renters, if more renters rent their home from a social landlord or a community-led charity that has their interests at heart, if more people are involved in a community-owned pub, visit it, value it, then fewer people are likely to either flee economic decline on the one hand or be pushed out by regeneration on the other. If people have a stake in a local business or a local community project, then there are more local people with more reasons to stay, more money circulating locally, more institutional capacity to invest in the really long-term changes that are needed to turn deprived places around. I'd also point to this really interesting thing that's now emerging. Many of you will be aware of Local Trust Big Local project, which since 2011 has been giving out grants of £1 million to community-led initiatives in 150 deprived neighbourhoods across England. Local Trust is sadly now in its final year of operation. All good things must come to an end. But it is seeking to support the big local groups that it has helped to create across the country to continue their work under this new banner of Amazing Communities Together. And many, many, many of these big local groups have already formed a community land trust or are planning to do so as part of how they plan to get the the sort of institutional security and longevity to continue that work. So it's really interesting to see that when you've got some funding in place and when you've got some capacity support from something like local trust, there are plenty of other organisations that can provide it. These solutions really do work for our very most deprived communities. They're a way for people to organise, to say yes to the housing they want, not just no to other people's plans for housing they don't want. The other really interesting thing I'd note about it is that community-led approaches are very effective for working through trade-offs. So I've seen countless examples now, and Tom mentioned some at the beginning, of communities weighing up the need for new housing, new social community infrastructure against much loved green spaces and garden space, and coming to a compromise, saying, okay, we do love these green spaces, but we desperately need housing. We can see the value of this proposed development. What if we gave up a little bit of this patch of open grass that isn't really doing anything, use that for housing, but then improved this other patch of green space over here so that it can really meet people's leisure needs? Getting to that kind of compromise is something that the system that we've set up, a local government-led system of planning, finds it really difficult to do. Whereas if you can empower communities, give them real agency and engage them in an adult conversation about the trade-offs involved in development, it is just amazing what solutions you can unlock. And community land trusts have proven their worth in finding those solutions.
Absolutely, that's really interesting, and it's the difference between having a say in something that's happening and being told that it's going to happen. And you touched on something there that I think is actually really interesting and an important distinction to make, which is the risk of developments that are imposed on people is, as you mentioned, gentrification. But regeneration doesn't have to mean gentrification. Would you just tell us a bit about the difference between those two as you see it?
Well, think about a community, two deprived communities in need of regeneration. A government comes along and says, we're actually going to provide the funding and policy support to make this happen. If one of those communities was relying overwhelmingly on the private rented sector to house people on low and moderate incomes, and another had access to a pool of social housing, community housing that is right priced to be affordable to local people, has some guarantees over security, quality and the like, the community with that community housing, with access to housing which is tailored to meet local needs, is going to be much more resilient to the process of gentrification. Whereas the community that's relying on the private rented sector to house a very large proportion of its lower income households is going to be much more vulnerable. Once that investment comes in, conditions start improving, the place becomes more attractive, house prices start increasing, rents start increasing. All of this is a good and necessary thing. It's a sign that the investment is working, that regeneration is taking hold, that the place is becoming more attractive, that demand is increasing. That's going to make it easier to keep making things better. But on the other hand, of course, those rising prices and rents will also push out the local people and the local businesses on whom that initial change depended. And that's clearly not right morally for those people. It's also not smart technically, because you need those people that know their place and love their place to make that regeneration successful. So providing that community-based solution is a way of keeping the fabric of the community solid, which is the right thing to do, but it's also the effective thing to do.
It's really interesting because I think there's often a lot of talk about people's opposition to social housing being built near them, and something I've seen around the country, I mean Grimsby, which I mentioned earlier, and Hull, which you just mentioned, is actually most people don't want to see their neighbours priced out of their community. They don't want to live in a place that is hollowed out, where the person who works in their local hospital can't afford to live. People want mixed communities. They want to support each other. It's just making sure they've got the tools to do it. Thank you very much, Rose. Mark, you chaired Labour's Community Ownership Commission. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Sure. So, quite a while ago now, probably nearly 2 years, Lisa and Andy announced Labour would support or introduce a right to buy for community assets. So we were really looking at how to make that a reality. So I guess when you look at the demand for community ownership, it's very large, as is the potential, and actually as is the need. So I'm actually very excited to meet Nicholas today, because I spend my time as a visiting professor at Staffordshire University, and I'm trying to work on the economic well-being in Stoke-on-Trent. So in the city, for example,
we should meet for tea in Stoke-on-Trent, Mark.
Indeed, definitely.
Thank you. Networking live. Sorry, Vicky.
No, one of the big landlords in the city, said publicly that maybe 40% of the commercial space in the city is uneconomic. And so if you face that, you have to think, well, how do we regenerate high streets and city centres when we've got those challenges? Clearly, we've got to think about all alternative uses. And for me, community ownership is part of that solution. We spoke to the NHS, and they think one of the ways they will solve some of the challenges they have is by moving health into the community, as you see in Whitton Lodge's housing trust in Birmingham. So there's a demand and a need, yet at the moment, relatively low levels of success. So there are probably 8,000 assets in community ownership. But since the Localism Act of 2011, there were 8,000 listings of assets of community value, and only 200 of those have moved into community ownership. So communities have huge awareness of assets that are valuable to them, but a real inability to actually shift that ownership. And there's a set of reasons, but we just touched on some of them there, which is often communities are not ready. And I think, one that means, and particularly in probably the areas where they need community ownership most. So, village pubs in reasonably well-off rural areas are a pretty easy transaction. Trying to create a community hub in, say, Shepherd's Bush, just down the road from me, is much more challenging. So there's community readiness, there's partly the willingness of local authorities, but actually their ability to support, because often they don't have the resources. And if you look at what local authorities are doing, and Birmingham's a great example, things like business support, community support have to get cut when childcare and adult social care are sucking so much of their resource in at the moment. And then there is, as Tom alluded to in the manifesto, funding. And I think there's quite a lot of private capital around, but often, although it's positioned as social impact funding, it's looking to earn commercial rates on the back of government funded grants. So actually, I would argue if you're a social impact investor, you need to have a discount rate that allows for some social impact in the price. And often that's not the case. And then the community ownership fund, and again, Tom mentioned this in the manifesto, we think can work better. At the moment, it's probably giving away money at about half the rate it needs to sort of meet its objective of being invested over the 4 years it was set up for. And again, part of that comes back to the other reasons, but our suggestion, and probably our most, I think, interesting recommendation, is that we would move to a place-based funding model. So we'd take the community ownership fund, allocate it to places, local authorities of whatever form, probably for me beneath the combined authority level, but to be seen. That then gives you a basis. We recommended the British Business Bank has its mandate changed to include community ownership, so that again we could then access some of their funds on a place basis as well. Think of community shares, community development finance institutions as pretty place-based investors or sources of capital, and you create pots of capital at a local level, which we then want to see allocated by local authorities working with community representatives to come up with a plan, to make the allocation, and to monitor those investments going forward. And I think then you have a platform by which places can engage with philanthropists, they can engage with other funders like the National Lottery, and with private capital, but on a much more equal basis. So I think that there's then better deals to be done. And we see that applying to housing, to energy, which again are part of Labour's focus very much, community housing, community energy, to community ownership, but also segmented. So we really like, for example, the Music Venues Trust, who have raised a fund to buy venues, to protect venues for live music. And we think those sector-based initiatives could be football clubs, could be health, could be education, all of that then gives us the expertise that community land trusts, for example, already bring in I would call it a vertical way to places. We could do that for multiple sectors. And I'd see, and Rose talked about this, housing, very central to that, because if you have a housing development, you do want a local community hub, you do want an allotment. We know all of these are things communities want. So our other recommendation was to create a list of facilities a community could reasonably expect to have access to. And in that, if a community then proposes that use for a building or piece of land, a council ought to be minded to approve it rather than minded to maybe not approve it if it doesn't meet with its other sort of objectives, if you like. And it's a bit akin to the 15-minute city, which in you know, sort of become a bit politicized, but I think the concept is there, right? What should communities be able to access, and how can we help them do that? And really, again, as I think I really like the manifesto, joining all of these pieces together. So it isn't one or two things, it is the 10 that Tom outlined, or the 5 we did on that piece.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And that's why having a growth lab to support communities seems like such a good idea.
Yeah.
You've also touched on something there that I come across quite a lot, which is private companies who say that their investments are a social impact, but who expect market returns. And that to me does seem at odds with what will create places that people actually want to live often. So I think that's definitely something that's going to continue unfolding for some time. Kane, I just wanted to return to you now that we've heard from everybody. You said something at the start that really struck me, which is that trust is broken. And I think it is. So I wanted to ask, now that we've heard about the manifesto, we've heard about the different perspectives on why community land trusts are the way forward, why do you think it is broken? And how do you think giving communities more of a stake in development could restore it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So why is trust broken? Well, the situation that we're in at the moment, really. There are over 1.2 million households on a waiting list for council homes and social homes. So there's a broken trust in government and housing associations to provide affordable housing. Meanwhile, the price of housing is going up and up and up, which is very good if you're a homeowner in certain areas, but awful if you're a young person or someone on a lower income, or you're more vulnerable in the precarities of the private rental sector. So there's a lot of trust that we've had in institutions, in local authorities and housing associations that haven't been met in dealing with the housing crisis. And then, of course, even if you do have a council home or a social home, there's no guarantee that it will be very well cared for. So how that fits in with CLTs is that CLTs can bypass some of the planning restrictions that we have. So they can win broad community support if the community can rally behind a CLT. And a CLT, of course, won't have the branding issues of some of the housing associations. And then CLTs have a good record in taking grants from local authorities or government. So you have the success story of the London CLT, which started after the Olympics planning process started. So you have the potential there for CLTs to kind of latch on to any government infrastructure projects. So there are probably really good opportunities at the moment. So East West Rail, for example, there are sites that are still being allocated from Bletchley to Cambridge, and there will be new railway stations. As a part of the granting of the railway stations, hopefully we'll see a lot of housing development around those stations to provide much more affordable housing in those areas with good connections to Cambridge, Milton Keynes and Oxford. And there are possibilities there for CLTs to get Section 106 grants of land. And then, of course, you've got rural exception sites where housing associations or local authorities might not want to touch small sites in the countryside. CLTs can fit in there and also win support of communities because, again, they don't have some of the branding issues. Yeah, so there's really good potential here for delivery of house building because of the urgency of the situation we find ourselves in and some of the abilities of CLTs to bypass some of those broken trust and broken relationship with other providers of housing.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Beth from the Community Land Trust Network because we've got time for some questions now.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you to all the speakers as well for such a rich discussion so far. So we've had a few questions come in. I think moving straight on from that idea of trust being broken, and we've also heard from Rose about the importance and the benefits of community ownership for ordinary people. We've had a question here from Lorraine around NIMBYism and linked to perhaps concerns around other local infrastructure, so health facilities, public transport. And I wonder whether there's something there about when it comes to raising awareness of then community land trusts and community ownership to the general public, what do you think will resonate? Vicky, I think that might be a good question for you, given your job. But if others want to chip in there as well, I think that would be really, really great.
Yeah, I think what will resonate with people is actually very, very simple. And my feeling generally, when I am at the main party conferences or in Westminster, listening to politicians launch planning reform, for instance, is that it gets so overcomplicated. People know what their communities need. People are worried about what their communities lack. And I think just saying, hey, here's a way that you can have a say in what's going to happen, not just on your street, but in your village, in your town, and making it simple is all that's needed. I really, really think when you boil it down, like there's a pub near me, it's a really good example. It was bought by a private developer, but it was on this residential street where people would all come together, and everybody, completely unprompted, got together, pulled money and bought the pub. They didn't need any encouragement to do that. They did it because that pub was so important to them that they didn't want it to be demolished or turned into flats that nobody on that street would be able to afford. So I think there's something in that. And if you can harness that care that people already have and simplify the processes, you're onto a winner.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to add to that?
I would.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead,
Kane
Rose.
and then Rose.
Oh, okay. Yeah, on the concerns about overwhelming public infrastructure or local infrastructure, it's a really valid concern that some people have in regards to their community because they want to protect the character of it. But particularly in the southeast and in the university towns, a lot of the people who will live in these new homes already live in the community. We see vast numbers of housing being split up into HMOs. So you have lots of people living in your local community that already live in quite poor conditions. And then of course there's the upside. Lots of business owners are very YIMBY because if you own a cafe or a pub and there are more people within short walking distance, within that 15-minute walking distance, you'll see a real boost to your business, and it only serves to strengthen the community and the resilience within that community.
On what's going to help to spread this idea further amongst the public and amongst politicians, I think it's quite right that the most important thing is just to enable this approach, make the message simple. I also think the signalling from central government, regional government and local government really matters too. So thinking about community-led housing and community-led approaches to asset ownership more broadly, mentioning it as an option, and thinking about it when you're doing things like reforming leasehold, thinking about how that may affect a community land trust model, acknowledging it as an important part of the system. Likewise, thinking about it in any policy on public land. So I think until we get to a point where community-led approaches are fully integrated into the broader funding and policy support packages government gives for housing and regeneration, the very, very least government should do is signal its intention to do that by acknowledging the role for community-led approaches and what's the right word for it, proofing new policy ideas that could have unintended consequences for that model.
Brilliant, thank you. And that kind of connects into a few other questions here that have come in from community land trusts. And Mark, you mentioned
place-based funding models and creating these pots of capital at a local level. So we've got two community land trusts here, Oxfordshire CLT and Calder Valley CLT have asked questions. These are CLTs that are now doing multiple projects. So they've kind of proven their credibility, they have delivered, but they are still struggling to get the money to then keep going and doing all the great stuff that they're doing. Do you have anything that you could kind of expand on with that? If in this moment of time right now that money doesn't exist, what could they be doing? Oh, you're on mute, Mark. Still on mute. There we go.
Sorry, there was a panel across my unmute button. I couldn't access it there. It's trapped. You know, you wouldn't think I once worked for IBM, but sorry. Could you tell me the question again? I was so busy just battling with my unmute button.
So no, that's fine. So just where we have these two, you'd mentioned these low pots of capital available at local level, so there's place-based funding, and we've had two community land trusts, Oxfordshire and Calder Valley, come into this asking questions. They are schemes that have developed multiple schemes now, so they've proven their credibility. The money doesn't exist right now. There's obviously you've set this ambition, but what could they do at this very moment?
Yeah, it's you know, we asked earlier, I think someone asked earlier about how we can more empower communities, and I think, you know, one of the challenges is politicians are not necessarily willing to give away power and resource very easily. So place-based funding is going to be quite a culture shift, I would say. You know, but it is also true that I think there is funding there that probably isn't always accessed as such. You know, the community ownership fund, for example, isn't I don't think it's probably going to have £50 million left in the tank at the end of whenever the parliament is that it hasn't used. So there are the resources there as well. Equally, I think there are you know, sort of other sources of funding, private funders, and housing as being compared to, if we look at other sectors, has certainly been one where it's been more able to raise equity and debt than is the case in, say, community hubs, which tend to be sort of 60-70% grant funded. So I think, you know, trying to maybe talk to some of these impact investors and put them under a little bit more pressure to be very purposeful might be one way to try and free up some of that or create some more capital in the short term.
Brilliant. Thank you. A few other questions that we have. So this one is an anonymous question, but it's how can we ensure diversity and inclusion with community land trusts? So how can we increase that as well? I think that's a big issue that the movement is grappling with. This is vital to ensure communities are designed for everyone, that all people are represented, that they have a meaningful influence, especially considering the disproportionate impact that the housing emergency is having on people of colour. Nicholas, I wonder, with the Left Behind Commission and stuff, do you have something, could you respond to that?
Partially. I think there are probably others who might be able to add more than I can. I think I'd say this, which is, as things currently stand, and again, this is not any way to criticise the CLT movement, it couldn't be otherwise, you know, this is a lot of work. There's a lot of time. You need to have the time, the capacity to put into it over many months and normally years. It's not to say that's only for, you know, white middle class people, but as a statement of some, you know, empirical fact, that tends to mean that it's people with a little bit of spare capacity, maybe early retirees, maybe, you know, people with some sort of professional background who often end up leading these. I'm not making a judgment there in how I say that, but that is what typically happens. So the easier we can make this, the nearer to normal, because the risk and the complexity goes down, I think the easier it is to face into that. There'll be other answers to this as well, which are perhaps more direct than sort of systemic. And I think the other thing is slightly nature different answer, but the ease with which you can now source what people like and what changes people want to see is just getting easier and easier. So, you know, I've been at many community workshops or planning workshops, and, you know, the people who will come on a Tuesday evening or a Saturday morning are often a little bit self-selecting, however hard you try. Again, that's not a criticism. But thanks to the marvels of these things, he's holding up a phone, let it be said, and laptops or whatever. It is now easier actually to feed in lots and lots of things from a wider group of people and find people who perhaps if it was just those Tuesday evenings you couldn't get to. So I think it is easier now to build that broader coalition. And what we see typically in successful community groups is, I mean, bluntly, there are 2 or 3 leaders who are sort of putting in the quite ludicrous amounts of time, and I say that's a compliment. But they do need legitimacy given to them by dozens, if not hundreds, of other people. And I think it is now getting easier to access those dozens of hundreds of other people. And I think it's acceptable to accept that most of them will put in a bit less time. There you go. That's a partial answer. I think there's probably more you could do. You could say more to that.
Thank you, Nicholas. Does anyone want to add anything else? Mark, you got your hand up.
Yeah. So just to share what our thinking on the Community Ownership Commission. And again, we've talked a bit about this, but making that link between community development and ultimately community ownership, be that of housing, of a pub or whatever. So actually thinking now about which communities need help, so we can actually target them and making some of the funding available to get those communities to a place where they can at some point take on asset ownership or put together bids. So again, I think we could clearly target that at those communities where we think there's a more positive need. We recommended 50% of community ownership funding should go to the 30% most deprived places, or most needy places measured by indices of multiple deprivation. Clearly, you could also look at other characteristics of places to think about where that support might go. But there's a huge slug of money hopefully coming with the next round of dormant assets funding, which is obviously what's underpinned a lot of the work Local Trust has done to date. So again, I think making sure that we advocate for some of that funding to be used in ways to boost diversity is something to think about.
Thank you, Mark. And Vicky, and then Rose, and then I've got one more question that I'll put to the panel.
I was just going to say, I think this is actually a really, really important piece of the puzzle. And again, it's something that's often complicated far more than it needs to be. It's about engaging with people in your community and not making judgments about what other people might think is important versus what you think is important, right? I'm thinking about a couple of places. I grew up in South London. I live in London. I'm just thinking about a couple of places recently that have been threatened with being closed down that are very, very important to communities in South London, like Nor, Cash and Carry is one example. And actually the whole community got behind Nor, even though not everybody used Nor or understood the importance of Nor initially. And I think it's about talking to people, and that is something that you need to have the time to do. I completely understand. But I think East Marsh United actually is another really good example of this, because the homes that they were buying into community ownership were for people in the community who were on low incomes. And that was an example of working very intersectionally. So I think it is about encouraging people to talk to each other and go into spaces they wouldn't normally go into and understand them. You might not use a mosque. A mosque might be very important in your community. So maybe you need to talk to the people, for instance, who do use it. That's just one example.
May I quickly just add a quick thing on East Marsh if there's time, just for 30 seconds? I mean, interesting is, as I mentioned to Vicky in the chat, by coincidence, Chris Streets is actually working with East Marsh United, and some of the team were up there the other day. It comes to that point of stewardship and breadth. So, they're not just doing what Vicky very eloquently described. They're also planning to plant street trees. They have already planted trees in a local park. Half of my team were up the other day working with them, planting trees in a local school. There are plans to work out how they can systematize the improved thermal performance of not just their houses but others through a sort of building design code to improve both the look of the houses but also actually the cost of the outer run. So if you like, they're thinking across the whole range of things that no normal developer would do. And again, that's not necessarily an attack on the developer. You're just, if you live there, you care about the trees in the park as well as about the houses, and so that's the point. Sorry, I rant over, but I just sort of felt that's such a good example. It felt worth emphasizing.
Thank you, Rose.
I'd also add, I think it's really important that we celebrate and champion the examples that there are out there of community-led approaches and of CLTs that are modelling the principles we're talking about. So Chapeltown Co-housing in Leeds is not an example of a white middle-class project. So I think we need to find these examples, we need to celebrate them. Some of the best known examples of CLTs do reflect more rural character, because that model has been going for longer and those examples are more mature. New examples are coming through, let's celebrate them, even when it's a little bit awkward, because the interesting thing about some of these examples is that what makes them great, what makes them effective, what makes them so responsive to a diverse community is that they're taking a much more flexible approach to, in this case, meeting housing need than mainstream approaches can. So Chapel Town co-housing is not about social and affordable housing. It's about private rented homes that are locked to local housing allowance, because that happens to be what best responds to the needs of that community. You've got a lot of single men with low incomes that aren't going to get social and affordable housing any decade soon, but they can access this LHA linked PRS model. It can be a bit awkward to celebrate when we've got a political narrative which can be very strong on social and affordable housing and have less room for those more creative solutions, but I think it's really important that we do so.
Thank you. We have hit just after 3 o'clock. I know that people are going to go in terms of the participants. I'm going to ask one more question, and just given who is attending today, it's based on maybe some of the intricacies within the community-led infrastructure itself. So this is from Nicholas Falk from Urbed Trust. And Tom, I think this would be directed to you. So why are so many CLT initiatives in the southwest and so few in the east side of England? Could it reflect the appeal to living close to beautiful countryside, or is there a political factor at work?
Thanks. It's a good question. I mean, maybe there's something in the water, but if you look at the number of communities wanting to do CLT development, there's no disproportionate cluster in the southwest. And there is, in fact, we've done work with the ONS showing there's disproportionate presence of CLTs in the most deprived parts of the country and in a lot of urban areas. But there's a lot of success in the southwest because some of those conditions I described earlier are in place. So they have access to land opportunities through an existing mainstream policy, the rural exception site. You don't need some complicated community route to land. They're using the things that the planning system offers them to get access to land. They have really effective enabling intermediaries across the region with Middlemarch or Cornwall CLT or others. So communities have access to support, and in Nicholas's words, normal people can do it. You don't have to be heroic to want to do a CLT in those places, because those people will provide all that support for you. They will partner you with housing associations and developers, and almost all of the projects there are partnerships in that way. So you don't have to do the heavy lifting. You don't have to raise the finance. You don't have to figure out how to manage and develop a housing scheme. The only bit that's been missing really is finance. And for periods, government has provided that through things like the Community Housing Fund. But it's deeply frustrating to me that at the same time, the government is struggling to deploy its affordable homes programme with billions of pounds. It can't find a way to channel about 10 million of that down to communities to help bring the projects forward that will then be going into the affordable homes programme to bid for the capital funding to build them out. So you would only need a few small tweaks to the existing system for that to really take off in the southwest, and you need those same tweaks in other parts of the country. Almost none of that has been anything to do with the Localism Act or those community rights or what have you. It's using the system and tweaking the design of the system for community ownership and community-led approaches to work. There's no reason we couldn't be taking that same approach to central London or Manchester or the east of England, or looking at the likes of East Marsh or others, we described, and doing that across Lincolnshire or up into the northeast. It could be done everywhere. It just happens that in the southwest, for a variety of reasons, we've got the enabling conditions right. And that's really the vision for the whole country, is to get into the point where you can have that level of penetration, that every community could use these tools to make themselves more prosperous, more sustainable, more equal, more inclusive.
Great, thanks, Tom. We have a few more questions. We will try and answer those in our post comms, and we'll get back to you in emails as well. Thank you very much. I'll pass over to Tom now for the final thank yous and goodbyes.
Yeah, just thanks so much to Vicky in particular for chairing this, and to Nicholas, Kane, Rose and Mark for their contributions and thoughts. It's been really interesting, and to everyone who's been listening in and asking questions. We'll be putting this up on our website soon, and really happy to have further conversations if people want to come to us and talk about ideas or how we take this forward. And to our members, we will be mobilising whenever we hear there's actually a general election called, to ensure that candidates hear about this as well, and parties really get the message that this is something they should be supporting going forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.